Hello friends and welcome to Stratification. This is unit 5 of your syllabus and stratification will be completed over a three-part series. So it will be the trilogy of stratification which will complete unit 5. Now this is a very large and very important chapter and its implications are far beyond direct questions on stratification. For example, paper 2 of sociology is Indian sociology, which will largely revolve around the caste system. So, if you have a good idea of social stratification and you can bring those concepts into answering questions on caste, you can add a lot of value and get a lot of extra marks for your paper 2. So let's get down to it. Social stratification refers to unequal relations between individuals and groups in society. Now, when we see unequal, we must understand what is the opposite. The opposite is equality. Equality often can be of three types. There is equality of outcome, which, if you are familiar with the discourse in the West on sociology, is known as equity. There is legal equality, which is manifested if you study polity. For example, Article 14 of the Constitution is one of the best examples of legal equality. Everybody is equal in the eyes of the law and has the equal protection of the law. Similarly, a Protection of Civil Liberties Act is also empowers legal equality. So everybody is equal in front of the law. Equality of opportunity is perhaps something like legal equality, but a little more social. This might be political and this is a little more socio-economic. Here we can give an example of the earliest forms of equality of opportunity legislation as the Equality Pay Act of 1963 in the United States, where American women were given the right to earn exactly the same amount of money as their male counterparts. So Sutherland and Maxwell describe stratification as a process of differentiation which places some people higher than others. Naturally, this will have to start out at some stage. Where will this process of differentiation begin? You have differences that exist clearly between people. Some can be natural and others can be man-made. The first stage of stratification is differentiation. You look at these natural or man-made differences and you notice them. Natural differences could be based on sex, color, geography. Man-made could be wealth, skills, status and power. At this point, we need to speak about this American anthropologist G.D. Berriman. Berriman says something interesting, that the main cause of stratification and inequality is differentiation. Differentiation on basis of these factors or these factors. Interestingly enough, G.D. Berriman was an American anthropologist and a sociologist. My colleague would have explained to you that there is a fine difference between the two, where anthropology and sociology sort of begins, and Berriman was at the time and place where one was transitioning from the other. So he used a lot of sociological and anthropological methods in his career. He did an interesting job. He studied racial inequality in the United States. And he compared it to the caste system in India. And this is something that you might think that has very little to do with each other, but it is a good idea of understanding how stratification can happen in completely independent environments. The next stage after differentiation is the evaluation stage. People notice differences between one another and they start evaluating one another. And that evaluation can happen on three parameters. Process of stratification is the evaluation process. Differences exist between people, but you will always have to find a way to rank those differences. So, for example, you have these three kind of resources that exist in any society: power, prestige and property. So natural In the natural world, these differences would be of one type, and in the man-made world, they would be in of another type. So power could be actually physical power, strength in a sort of a primitive communism environment. Prestige would be the recognition from others. Perhaps you're a skilled hunter, you really do well in hunting. Finally, property, that is the wealth owned. Now, earlier, nobody really owned property, so it was mostly relationships that counted. You know, who do you get along with in the tribe? Who do you get along with in the band? Are you a nice person? Do people consider you to have a good reputation? Are you honorable and decent? Now, in the man made world, the differences manifest in a different way. Power will be according to sort of political position. So, let's say you're a member of the aristocracy, then you will have some bit of power, considerable power. As a matter of fact, aristocracy say badi to monarchy bhi hogi, where the king has the ultimate amount of power, especially in absolute monarchies. Prestige would be different from being a skilled hunter, which is in the natural world. Prestige would perhaps be in the man-made world, maybe in the Middle Ages, from being a priest, of being of the priestly caste. And finally, property is quite simple. In the man-made world, property was not necessarily relations as much as it was land and unfortunately also slaves. So when people are evaluated on the basis of their ascribed and achieved characteristics, a social hierarchy is formed. A social hierarchy has come as a result of the processes of differentiation, evaluation, as in we evaluate the differences that exist between people, and we begin to start ranking them, and that is what leads to a hierarchy. Sorry, the H's are quite hard to make on this software. Now, if you look at the forms of hierarchies, you can tell that there are these two forms and the explanatory indicators underneath as in what they are. So, for example, in India, hierarchy would generally be pyramidal in the sense that the top few percentages of the population have the greatest amount of power and prestige and all the rewards that are associated with being high in the hierarchy, where the bulk of the population will be down the ladder. In any middle class Western society, it will be more diamond shaped, where the middle class dominates and there is a small elite at the top and another sort of small underclass that exists at the bottom here. So within hierarchy, people at different positions and within different places in this structure can claim different sets of rewards. People at the top can claim higher rewards and higher privileges. So the moment we take a hierarchy like this and we add something called differential rewards, that is when we lead to stratification. So let's just recap the different processes that lead to social stratification. Stage one is differentiation, which is here. Two is, well, you evaluate the differences between people. Three, you rank them. Four, you reward people who have more, who have what society considers the most rewarding, the highest position in the hierarchy, and this leads to stratification. And the interesting thing is that stratification, it is argued, leads to more stratification. So it could, if you look at the Marxist perspective, lead to some kind of a vicious cycle in which the upper classes get differential rewards and they convert those differential rewards into a perpetual hegemony. And that's why Marx basically was talking about the polarization of Western industrial societies into two very, very opposite groups, the haves and the have nots, and where the haves have almost control over all productive assets and the have nots have nothing but their own labor. Perhaps they don't even have purchasing power by the end of it. And if you look at Berryman's point of view, he says that all of this process starts with differentiation. And that's a very interesting thing to look at, because wherever there will be greater differentiation, be it racial, religious, ethnic, um, or just differences in wealth, etc., this process will become more and more salient, and it will have an overflow into the evaluation, ranking, and rewarding stages. So it makes social stratification quite a tricky topic to discuss. As he's mentioned, the more complex the division of labor, or the more heterogeneous the society in terms of race, religion, national origin, the more ways they are to judge people, and hence to allocate them different positions in the hierarchy according to either achieved or ascribed status. You will hear about these achieved and ascribed again and again in sociology. And achieved status is basically what society has evaluated you as an individual by what you have achieved, whereas ascribed is what you have, uh, what you're born with, what social group were you a part of when you what social group are you a part of by perhaps blood or perhaps inheritance. So if we look at Indian caste system, it is largely an ascription based system in which higher castes are ascribed to be more pure and more competent than the lower castes. And if you look in the West, hierarchy is more achieved in the sense that if you look at North America, most people take pride in the fact that their grandfathers or their fathers were poor and they had risen from the bottom of the system to the top. Now let's look at stratification from these four perspectives. So let's look at it from a money point of view. So money, or let's use property actually. So in differentiation stage one, some people own less property, some people own more property. The people owning more property will be evaluated and be found to be superior to the people owning less property. Then they will be ranked according to how much property they have, and the ranking system will reward those through social sanction with more assets and more property, and this will lead that class with most property to the top position in the stratified hierarchy. And with those differential rewards, remember, differential rewards are a very important part of the stratification process. Stratification, as mentioned here, is hierarchy plus differential reward. So if you're sitting on the top here and you get maximum number of rewards, you will also get more stratification, which will reinforce the elite's position. This is the Marxian point of view. Of course, we can differ on different. We can look at it from various axes, like the functional approach and the value neutral approach, and Weber's multiple hierarchy approach. Just a word here about Weber. If you're studying stratification, then Weber is the Bap of stratification. Him and C.W. Mills are probably the two people who have given a remarkable and very nuanced explanation of what stratification is. And we are really beholden to these two, because Marx kind of gives a very simplistic and very more one-dimensional idea, and the functionalists don't take into account the exploitation angle. So Weber and Mills, W and M, these two chaps, they have given a very complex and a very succinct and applicable vision of stratification, something that you might see in your day-to-day lives, and we will read more about these two later. And I think Weber especially deserves an entire chapter, an entire video for him. So T.B. Botmore, this gentleman, talks about stratification in earlier societies. We only started really looking at stratification in the mid 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was going on and property rights were so set in stone and so well established that it appeared like the haves will have everything and the haves nots will have nothing. And that's when people started asking, where does this inequality come from? So they naturally looked to the past and asked themselves, did we have such inequality in the past? And this gentleman, T.B. Botmore, classified four forms of inequality that existed earlier in pre-industrial societies. So the earliest form is slavery, where you They effectively just own a person. And the social structure is divided between slaves and citizens. Slaves could be owned by individual citizens or by the state or society as a whole as well. So you had two forms of slaves very often. And the difference between slaves and citizens was citizens had rights and slaves had no rights. After that, we have in Europe, especially the estate system, which is very interesting. It was between 7th and 17th century Europe, and it fluctuated a large degree. But here, estates were established in three fields: the nobility, who were who would uphold the political and the military system; the serfs to work the fields; and the clergy to pray. Now, the clergy had two tasks. One was to give individual solace to man, uh, to relieve the anxieties of people, to make them accept the hierarchy, to counsel them to listen to their grievances. But they also had a second role, which was to legitimize the ruling class, which were in this case normally the nobility. So there was a nexus always here between physical force and spiritual claims to legitimacy, which was conferred by the clergy to upon the nobility. And finally, and well, penultimately, we have caste, where there's the fixing of occupation, status, and rights by birth. This is too brief a description of caste. We're going to look at this later in much greater detail, because caste has proved to be a very complicated form of stratification. It has a time dimension, it has a geographical dimension, it has a spatial dimension, and we're going to look at all of that. Finally, the social classes that we are familiar with today, which are consequent to economic factors, that is, greater degree of mobility. I think one would easily find the social class system well accommodated within the earlier diamond shaped diagram that we had shown here. So the modern class system is probably more like this, what you see in the West. So we have this man, Peter Bourdieu. I'm Pierre Bourdieu. He is a French scholar, and he wrote a book called Distinction: A Social Critique of Judgment and of Taste. So he was active in the 60s and 70s in France and in Western Europe, and he looked at stratification from various points of view, and he came up with four forms of social capital that people have. Four forms of capital: economic, that is how much money you have; cultural capital, such as your education and qualifications and status; uh, social capital, as in your contacts, your social associations; and symbolic capital, like good reputation, etc. So let's look at it from individual points of view to give you examples of these. Economic capital would be land, tangible wealth, purchasing power, etc. Cultural capital will be your education, qualifications, and status. Think about it from this point of view, that in India, even today, if somebody is not a graduate, if a middle class person is not a graduate, usko shadi ke rishte nahi milte. It's seen as a bit of a black mark. So that person who has not graduated, even if he has high economic capital, has low cultural capital because he's not a graduate. So this shows the importance of cultural capital. The next is social capital. These are contacts and social associations that uh, you have access to. So this is pretty self-explanatory. किसको जानते हो, किसकी बाप आप किसके बेटे हो, कौन आपका भाई है, ये सारा सोशल कैपिटल में आता है. एंड फाइनली सिंबॉलिक कैपिटलिज्म इज आपकी सोशल स्टेटस क्या है, लोग आपके बारे में सोचते क्या हैं. लाइक इन इंडिया दे लाइक टू से कि लोग क्या सोचेंगे. दैट इज अ इंडिकेटर ऑफ सिंबॉलिक कैपिटलिज्म कैपिटल. Now, generally, we've looked at hierarchy from the Marxian perspective so far. But let's look at it from a functionalist point of view. In general, inequalities lead to stratification, and stratification, well, leads to hierarchy where inequalities are arranged in an order. A hierarchy is a symbol of rising specialization and differentiation in society. And the functionalists basically say that the hierarchy is based upon competence, that the person who is most competent to carry out a task will rise to the top of the hierarchy automatically, and it is for the better good of society, because in non-tribal modern societies such as ours, we need to have a division of labor. And a division of labor means that different jobs will be ranked according to how important they are. And once you see how important they are, you'll often notice that the important jobs, only a few people can fulfill those jobs. Nobody can be a CEO of Hindustan Unilever just like that. You'll have to work 7 days a week probably. You will not have any personal time free. If you want to look at this from the point of view of this modern thinker called Jordan Peterson, you'll see that he is a big functionalist with regards to hierarchy, especially in the West. He says that hierarchy is necessary to provide the most skilled people to the most important jobs. The Marxist perspective is that, well, it is the design of the dominant class to oppress the lower classes. So Marx just looks at things like this within a hierarchy, that they are the have-nots and the haves. Have-nots are here and the haves are up here, and the system has been built for the benefit of these people who are the haves. And finally, you look at a value neutral view, which says that it provides direction to collective efforts. And you can well see that there is a similarity between what the functionalists say and the value neutrals say, and what Marxists say is exactly inversely proportional to what the functionalists say. Functionalist says कि हाँ stratification की जरूरत है यार, you need some leadership, हर टीम का कोई कैप्टन होना चाहिए. अब आगे देखते हैं. पॉवर्टी की कॉन्सेप्ट है एक. पॉवर्टी कॉन्सेप्ट इसलिए आती है क्योंकि in some societies the structure is diamond shaped, and in others it is triangle shaped. And in the triangle shaped society, bulk of population will automatically be termed as the poor part, or the people, the poverty afflicted part. Hence the definition has no real consensus. If you look at the European Union's definition of poverty, there are some fairly ridiculous things from an Indian point of view to be seen. For example, if you don't own a phone, you're below the poverty line in Europe. If you can't consume meat regularly, you're below the poverty line in Europe. In India, of course, we have various methods of gauging poverty. We tried the calorific index for a very long period of time. I think it specified 2400 calories per working man per day, and 1800 calories per working lady per day as the poverty threshold. So anybody higher than that would not be considered poor. Then, well, we changed that to various different indicators, certain rupees per day, etc. So poverty is a very interesting thing from the perspective of a sociologist who will view it completely different from an economist. Economist ने क्या करना है, उसे करना है यार, अच्छा poverty है, economist love numbers, उन्होंने कहना है इतने रुपीस के नीचे, 50 रुपए के नीचे ये poor है. Sociologist will not look at it this way. Sociologist will have a much more complicated idea about things. वो कहेगा ये absolute poverty है भाई, और relative poverty है. Absolute is कि यार are you actually poor vis-a-vis all human beings on earth, or are you poor vis-a-vis some section of the population which you are looking up to as your reference group? And this has led to something called dependency culture, and there's a big debate on this which happened in the West. So in the 1950s and 60s in England, what started was in England and in all of Western Europe, what started was the welfare state really took off, because you had strong labor parties and they wanted to steal the thunder of the communist bloc by providing a large number of benefits to the working class and to the middle class. And this meant unemployment insurance, this meant welfare checks for the people who are unemployed, this meant retirement benefits, so you get a certain amount of pension no matter how long you live, etc. And by the late 1970s, something very interesting happened. Britain, which was the manufacturer of all goods in the world from the Industrial Revolution till that point, began to lose its edge in the industrial sector. And this was largely because of the added costs of the welfare state and the collapse or the decline of English manufacturing, British manufacturing, led to the election of a lady from the Conservative Party called Margaret Thatcher. She was a political conservative, but she was in her ideology a classical liberal. We'll get down to what classical liberalism is. It's another discussion and an entire new thing. And during this discourse, two things came out, 2 points of view emerged. One point of view was that poverty has to be blamed upon the poor, that it is a lack of character, a lack of willingness कि आप तो जी आलसी हो, आपसे कोई काम नहीं होता, your poverty is your problem. And another school of thought that opposed that said blame the system view, that there are structural factors, caste exists, class exists, gender, ethnicity, which limit the amount of skill and social capital you can build up, and it leaves a large section of society in poverty. So this is an interesting point of view, and this is an interesting debate. It's still carrying on today. As a matter of fact, I would like to introduce a topic which may come in the exams called welfare creep. In almost all welfare states, we have seen that the welfare mandate of the government starts with the most basic thing, like perhaps preventing people from starving, or perhaps free emergency health care, things like that. But if you go ahead and look at welfare states 50, 60 years down that journey, you see that a lot of very unnecessary things come within welfare. I mean, in the US presently there is an urge among the young people, there's a demand among the younger sections of the population who want within the welfare state college education also to be covered, which is worth lakhs and crores of rupees. So this is called welfare creep, where the mandate of the welfare state gradually increases to more and more unrealistic demands. Let's carry on forward. Within the blame the system view, we have an interesting American anthropologist called Oscar Lewis. And his anthropology was largely the anthropology of slum dwellers. And he did a study of Mexican cities. And he believed that poverty was a vicious circle. He actually said the culture of poverty is both an adaptation and a reaction of the poor classes to their marginal position in a class stratified society. So that was Oscar Lewis's perspective. Further on, an interesting perspective is also provided by Herbert Hans. Yes, I personally like to call this perspective the California model. He says poverty persists as it is rewarding for a majority section who want various kinds of services. Now, if you look at California, the wealthy Californians want illegal immigration so that they can get maids, gardeners, people who are willing to work under minimum wage, etc. And this is an interesting point of view because once in a society the lower section is imported from outside, it provides a position to which it provides a benchmark to which the remainder of society should not fall to. For example, if you go to Norway, there's going to be even the most unskilled waiter at a restaurant or a truck driver. He's the lowest in the social strata there, but he still has a decent standard of living. By importing in these illegal laborers, what they're doing is lowering that minimum basic threshold. If you look at, for example, slum dwellers in Delhi, in Bombay, they're living on the streets. So you compare that is the lowest category of person in Bombay versus the lowest category of person in Norway. So Herbert Hans basically tries to say that it is a mechanism of trying to reward the majority section with various cheap services by keeping people in poverty and by bringing in poor people. Then naturally there's the feminist viewpoint that effectively says that poverty has been especially cruel to females. Of course, this can be debated and argued. Gunnar Myrdal, this man is a Swedish economist, and he wrote a book, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. And he effectively says that poverty is due to lack of access to institutional structures. That's one. Political systems. Two. And competitive markets. Three. Let's look at these in turn. So let's say Gunnar Myrdal did his study on the Negroes in America in the 1950s. So let's just use that example as sort of a benchmark. Back in the day, poverty among African Americans was because of institutional structures, like there weren't enough black people in the police or the judiciary. So institutions did not represent them. Political systems also did not represent the blacks because of Jim Crow laws, which were laws of segregation in certain states of the United States, which strongly discouraged or put obstacles in front of black people to not participate in the political process. They basically dissuaded blacks from participating in the political process. So they did not have access to political systems. Even today, if you look at the lowest Gram Panchayat, often it is dominated by the dominant caste of the village and does not have enough lower caste or OBC representation. So this can be seen in several different contexts. Finally, competitive market. In other words, value for their marginal labor. How much can they get for their labor? Are they welcome into the labor force? Naturally, the only way out of poverty in the long run is to actually work. So how much access do people have within a competitive capitalist economic structure to raise themselves out of poverty using their labor? This is another thing that Gunnar Myrdal points out. Finally, we have C.K. Prahalad, and C.K. Prahalad talks about, well, there are impediments to the erasure of poverty, but there are also opportunities here. This is rather interesting. If you were around in the early 2000s, and if you were if you're on the MBA circuit, you would know that C.K. Prahalad was the pet question of almost everybody. He's the management guru who effectively convinced FMCG companies to cater to the lowest of the lowest population, economic strata by introducing small sachets or tiny little tubes of toothpaste, very 1 rupee, 2 rupee items, so that the real purchasing power of the lowest class could be catered to. So with this